chemistry students. Today we are going to talk about the octet rule. Last time you learned about valence electrons, and you were going to use that skill to categorize if an atom will gain. And we'll say if an atom is gaining electrons, we'll use green for that today, or lose electrons. Losing, will make that one blue. Let's start out with a little bit of the definition of the octet rule. It began when a scientist observed that noble gases, or gases, elements with 8 valence electrons, are generally non-reactive. Gilbert Lewis used this fact to explain why atoms form certain kinds of ions in molecules. Ions just mean that the atom has a positive or negative charge. Okay. In general, the electron configuration for these non-reactive atoms is ns2np6. So atoms will gain or lose electrons to mimic that electron configuration. Lewis also explained that atoms tend to form compounds in a way that allows them to have 8 electrons in their highest occupied energy level. So that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to figure out how many electrons are in the highest occupied energy level and what an atom can do to have 8. The first way an atom will do that is by losing electrons. So if an element has 4 or fewer valence electrons, it will lose electrons in order to form an octet. In this process, the atom turns into a cation. So cat is just a way of indicating that it has a positive charge. So cat you can think of as plus. So a cation is an atom with a positive charge or more protons than electrons. 2 examples of cations are lithium and magnesium. Lithium's electron configuration is 1s2, 2s1. There is 1 electron in the highest occupied energy level, meaning that if lithium just loses that 1 electron, it will have a stable, well, not necessarily an octet, but its lowest energy level is full because the main level 1 is full with only 2 electrons. So it will form a cation. Or you could also say that it will lose electrons. Okay, magnesium has 12 electrons, and I will write out its electron configuration. This one has 2 electrons in the highest level. 2 is less than 4, so it is going to form a cation and lose electrons. Another way for an atom to form an octet is by gaining electrons. So if an element has 4 or more valence electrons, it will gain electrons in order to form an octet. Notice that number 4 was in both of these examples. That is because 4 is right in the middle. An atom with 4 valence electrons can lose 4 or gain 4, and both of those are the same amount of work. So it really depends on the type of bond that the atom is forming as to whether it will gain or lose them. It's kind of a flexible number of valence electrons to have. So if it does end up If the atom does end up gaining electrons, it will form an anion. And just like cat meant positive, an represents a negative charge. So an anion is an atom with a negative charge or more electrons than protons. An example of two common anions are oxygen and chlorine. Here is oxygen's electron configuration. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its highest energy level, meaning that it has 6 valence electrons, just larger than 4. So it will form an anion, meaning that it gains electrons. Chlorine's electron configuration. This atom has 7 valence electrons, meaning that it will likely form an anion and gain just that last electron that it needs to have the octet. Okay, let's practice. In this slide, we are going to practice writing electron configurations, calculating valence electrons, and then categorizing these atoms as either likely to gain or likely to lose electrons. First up is sodium with 11 electrons total. This element has 1 electron in its highest energy level. So I'm going to call it 1, and I'm going to use shorthand here. We'll just call them VEs for valence electron. So 1 valence electron, meaning that it will form a cation. Remember that cations lose electrons. Right. Next up is boron with 5. The highest energy level that's occupied is level 2. So this element has 3 valence electrons. 3 is less than 4, so boron will also form a cation. Fluorine has 9. This element has 7 valence electrons. So it will form an anion, meaning that it will gain an electron. Sulfur has 16 electrons total. This atom has 6 electrons in its highest occupied orbital, meaning that it has 6 valence electrons. It will form an anion by gaining electrons. Arsenic has 33 electrons total. Arsenic has 2 electrons in the 4s and 3 electrons in the 4p. 4 is the highest main level occupied, so that adds up to a total of 5 valence electrons, meaning that it will also form an anion by gaining 3 more electrons. Potassium has 19. This element has 1 valence electron. It will form a cation by losing that 1 electron. And finally, we have nitrogen with just 7 electrons. This atom has 5 electrons in its highest occupied main level, meaning that it has 5 valence electrons, and it will form an anion.